Welcome to Plant-Based History, Episode 1, Gluten in the Nile. Wheat has become a controversial grain, especially over the past decade. The increased awareness of celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, which are of course serious issues, make no mistake, in addition to the controversy around industrially produced wheat and GMOs, has driven the WebMD aficionados and paleo fantasy role players to new hypochondriacal heights, and in turn to seek grain alternatives, driving unprecedented demand for gluten-free products that has transformed grocery shelves and restaurant menus across the country. In fact, the recent keto and low-carb movements have demonized grains in general, to the point where popular culture is in a twisted sort of carb phobia. But all of this loses sight of the fact that grains, and wheat in particular, have played a critical role in the development of human civilization. Does wheat really deserve all the hate? If we take a closer look, much of the ill will directed at wheat can be traced to the role it plays in processed food production. You can find countless videos on GMOs, glyphosate, and a whole handful of other related topics on YouTube. We won't delve into that here, as these topics have been beaten to death and the solution is easy. To avoid GMOs and pesticides, buy organic. It's that simple. And for staple foods like wheat, it is eminently affordable, as I will demonstrate later in this video. We can also all agree, I'm sure, that processed foods are of dubious value from a nutritional perspective. But let's look past that, and take a deeper look into wheat, its critical role in human nutritional history, and the role it can play in your modern diet. Here's my success metric. The next time you pick up a box of heirloom quinoa noodles at the grocery store, I want you to ask yourself if it's really worth it to spend 3 times as much for an inferior, or at best equal product. From the dawn of human civilization in the Fertile Crescent, to the legendary bakeries of Egypt, and all the way to the sophisticated logistics of the Roman Empire, wheat has supplied a large portion of human nutritional needs, from the simple laborer to the warrior. Forget the paleo myth. Let's look at one of the early big dogs of civilization, one of the first large-scale agrarian societies, Egypt. What provided the majority of the ancient Egyptians' calories and protein? Hint, it wasn't meat. The Egyptian diet was comprised mostly of plant-based foods. In fact, a 2014 study from the Journey of Archaeological Science that looked at isotope ratios in bone, hair, and other organs from the remains of mummified humans and animals shows that this was consistent from 3500 BC all the way to 600 AD. To put this in perspective, modern omnivores, most people, consume roughly 64% of their total protein from animal sources, while modern vegetarians consume around 32% of protein from animal sources. Ancient Egyptians, on the other hand, are estimated to have consumed only 29% of total protein from animal foods. This means that the ancient Egyptians consumed far less protein from animal sources than the average American, and even the average vegetarian today.
But wait, what about fish?
Despite the fact that fish were plentiful, and even depicted in some Egyptian art, the isotope ratios identified by the archaeologists in the study I mentioned before indicate that fish were seldom consumed in the test specimens. There is even some controversy about religious prohibition of fish consumption for the priesthood class, and perhaps more broadly as well. We can't discount the fact that fish was likely consumed occasionally by those living along the Nile and in coastal areas, but it seems to have played a much smaller dietary role than expected. This is also in line with modern coastal blue zone cultures around the world. So, with fish, fowl, and mammal flesh out of the way, what foods actually provided the majority of calories for the ancient Egyptians? The evidence points to grains, predominantly wheat and barley. Barley was used primarily for brewing beer, which was a staple of the Egyptian diet across social groups. The beer brewed by Egyptians was thick, yeasty, and unfiltered, just like a good wheat beer you can find today. As for wheat, the Egyptians cultivated emmer wheat, which is an heirloom variety of wheat that is lower in gluten and more difficult than modern common wheat to grind into a smooth flour. The Egyptians used emmer wheat as a cereal, in stews and soups, and to create coarse flour for baking. This flour was made into dough and baked into bread, either flat or leavened. This bread was coarse, nutty, and hard, and provided the majority of calories for most ancient Egyptians, regardless of wealth. Some people point to the tooth degradation and decay apparent in Egyptian mummies as signs that their diet was deficient. But this is largely not the case. Because the Egyptians didn't have the technology to mill their grains in a mechanically efficient way, they used what is basically a primitive form of a mortar and pestle to create a coarse flour. This process resulted in stone and sand particles getting mixed in with the flour, which, through constant abrasion, wore away teeth over time. While bread and beer were the cornerstones of each meal, the Egyptians ate a variety of other vegetables as well. Common ingredients included gourds, celery, onions, beans and peas, and even lentils. Onions themselves played an especially important role in Egyptian society. The men who built the pyramids were given a daily ration of beer, bread, and onions. The holy trinity of ancient Egypt. Looks like we have a good start for our recipe. But how did the Egyptians make their food taste good? How does anyone make food taste good? Spices, of course. Commonly available spices in ancient Egypt included mustard, dill, cumin, coriander, and of course, salt. Now, you might be accusing me of portraying the Egyptians as iPhone-wielding, virtue-signaling vegans at this point. Obviously, that was not the case, but the evidence discussed previously, and linked in the comments below, points to them largely being vegetarian, just like all of the modern Blue Zone cultures. Of course, meat was consumed occasionally, especially by the wealthy at feasts and banquets. This is true of many cultures throughout history. But that does not change the fact that the vast majority of calories that the ancient Egyptians consumed, on average, were from plant sources. This was an empire built on bread, a juggernaut of gluten-fueled warriors whose civilization reached unprecedented heights. With all of this in mind, doesn't it seem ignorant and backwards to want to revert back to a meat-based or grain-free diet? After all, a caveman would be no match for an Egyptian chariot. How can you apply ancient Egyptian ways to your modern diet? Don't skip the wheat, unless you have celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. Whole wheat, yes, even modern GMO wheat, although you can go organic if you want, compares favorably to most other grains nutritionally. In many cases, wheat contains significantly more protein, vitamins, and minerals than more expensive grains. Take whole wheat pasta, for example. You can buy a pound of whole wheat organic pasta from Whole Foods for $1.49. Let's compare that to a popular pasta alternative in brown rice pasta, which can cost anywhere from 2 to 3 times as much. The whole wheat pasta trounces brown rice pasta in nearly every metric, from protein to iron to zinc and even fiber. So if you want to keep things moving in your gut, you should probably stick with the whole wheat. If you're still superstitious about gluten, you can always kick it old school with ancient wheat varieties like farro, which are very similar to the emmer wheat grown by the Egyptians. In fact, that's exactly what we'll be using in today's recipe. Ancient Egyptian grain bowl with smoky tahini sauce. Alright, let's start with the spices. Today we have some mustard powder, cumin, coriander, dill, cayenne pepper, and black pepper, and of course salt. You'll notice the dill is dried since I didn't have fresh on hand. You'll also notice that all of these spices are authentic ancient Egyptian spices. I like to mix them up in a separate bowl beforehand. It just makes it easier later on when I need to add them to the recipe. Alright, so let's look at our ingredients. The first up is farro. This is from Trader Joe's. It's parboiled and it cooks really quickly in about 10 minutes. It's also really cheap as well. I think it was like $1.49. 2 small onions. You could use 1 medium or 1 large, and those are yellow onions. And then we have 1 fresh red bell pepper. You see that beauty glistening in the light there? Next up we have 3 stalks of celery. And finally, 2 yellow squash. And I know these aren't technically ancient Egyptian or gourds, but they do fit into the spirit of the recipe because they are squash. We also have 4 to 5 dates as well. Alright, let's start our symphony of chopping here. Everything can be roughly chopped, I think. So we have our yellow squash, celery, onion, dates. Just give everything a nice chop. You'll have to pit the dates first as well. I wield a knife like a barbarian, so please don't critique or comment on my knife skills here, or lack thereof. Alright, next up we'll chop our red pepper. So here we have one of the infamous and dangerous nightshades, which we'll be talking about in next week's episode. Alright, here I'm finishing off the smoky tahini sauce. This contains tahini, lemon, smoked paprika, soy sauce, or any kind of gluten-free alternative if you're concerned about that, garlic powder, sriracha. Okay, that's not really an ancient Egyptian ingredient, is it? Liquid smoke, warm water, and ground flax. And flax is going to be our thickening agent here. You can see I'm adding a little bit of sriracha here to kick up the spice a notch. That's totally up to you. I blend it up. In this final shot, you can see the final texture, right? It's nice and creamy, and that comes from the added flax. All right, now remember, the Egyptians drank beer. It was a critical part of their diet. So in order to kind of play with that idea, I'm cooking the farro in 1 cup of wheat beer, and this will actually impart a nice flavor to it. So we have 1 cup of wheat beer as well as 1 cup of vegetable stock, which you can see here. We'll let that boil/simmer for about 10 minutes or so, and I want to do that covered, so I'll put the cover on, and that's that. Alright, so we're going to start by sauteing some onions and veggie broth, just a few tablespoons. You can also add some more as needed to kind of deglaze the pan, as you see there. The reason I did this instead of oil is we're trying an oil-free diet for health reasons, but obviously it would taste better with oil, so if you prefer that, go for it. Here I'm adding the celery and peppers to the pan. I want to saute those for a few minutes, then add the yellow squash last because that cooks the most quickly. We want that to kind of retain some of its crispness and not get too mushy. Okay, next we're going to add the spices, and doing the prep work beforehand makes it really easy. We just pour it in from our little bowl and give it a nice mix. Then we'll want to cover the dish, the saute pan, and let it simmer for a few minutes. Here's the farro after it's done. You'll notice there's a bit of extra water on the bottom. That's okay. Just drain it with any strainer. This is common with farro. It's kind of like pasta almost. Now we'll actually add our chopped dates to the mix. You can see they kind of stuck together. Just break those up as best you can, and then give them a nice stir. Let that saute for another few minutes, just to kind of, soften them up and cook in some of the flavor from the spices. Here we have our finished product. So serve the vegetable mix over the farro and drizzle the smoky tahini sauce on top. If I had it on hand, I would have also put some fresh dill on top for garnish and additional flavor. There it is, the ancient Egyptian grain bowl with smoky tahini sauce. Thanks for watching Food History Episode 1. Check back soon for the next episode covering nightshades. And also check out some of my other upcoming series which cover historical topics from a plant-based perspective.